Okay, I think we will get started now. Welcome everyone to the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network's Proxy Power webinar. My name is Tamara Herman, and I am the Capital Strategies Program Manager here at the Shareholder Association for Research and Education, or SHARE. And I'm based in sunny Vancouver today on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. The Canadian Capital Stewardship Network is a network of Canadian trustees and unions that's hosted here at SHARE. We came together about just over a year ago now to create a space to share information and foster opportunities for action where responsible investment and the labor movement intersect. If you're new to this work, this is the beginning of proxy season. It's a time of year where most companies that are listed on Canadian and US stock exchanges hold their annual general meetings. If you own a common voting share in that company, you have the right to vote for items that management or other shareholders will put on a ballot. So this really is a chance for shareholders to communicate with company boards and management about crucial issues that might include workers' rights or human rights issues. And even though proxy season happens every year, this year is a very, very important year for setting the groundwork for pandemic recovery. With the confluence of COVID-19 and racism, there's a growing recognition among investors that with their broad portfolios and their ownership in most companies listed on stock exchanges, they're not insulated against the crisis of deepening inequality that really has come to light this year with the past events. And there's also this recognition that addressing risks to a portfolio means addressing social issues as well. And at the same time, I've seen a shift in the expectation of stakeholders who participate willingly and unwillingly in capital markets around how companies and their investors should treat these systemic issues, be it climate, be it inequality, or be it racism. This is all reflected in some statements we've seen from some of the world's largest asset managers who have told us that they're raising the bar on how they expect portfolio companies to treat stakeholders, including workers, communities, consumers. But the challenge, of course, is to make these statements meaningful and actionable. It's to integrate the understanding that we're coming to that these social issues have systemic impacts on portfolios, to integrate this into investment decision-making processes, or the wheels and cogs of the financial system, if you will. And one of the most accessible ways to do this is through proxy voting. So we're going to use the next hour and 15 minutes to highlight shareholder resolutions and vote recommendations that advance human rights and workers' rights, and that address social issues such as race, gender, labor conditions, and pay. For trustees on this call, we invite you to urge the staff or service providers who vote your proxies to support these resolutions and vote recommendations. For those of you who vote proxies yourselves, we hope that you'll consider these items when you cast your ballots. And of course, if you want more information on anything, please feel free to reach out. The companies that we're going to be talking about today are either listed in Canada or familiar to us because they have such a large consumer footprint here. Dollarama, Chartwell, McDonald's, Walmart, and Amazon. And we've invited to speak with you today workers, organizers, trustees, and resolution filers. We have a pretty tight agenda with a really wonderful lineup of speakers. So we're going to be taking your questions at the end, but feel free to type them in the Q&A as the webinar progresses, and we will get to them. And just to let you know, this webinar is running for an hour and 15 minutes, and we'll be saving the last 15 minutes or so for questions. So we're going to start with Dollarama, which many Canadians will recognize as the country's leading low-cost value retailer. The BC Government and Service Employees Union, or BCGU, is filing a resolution asking Dollarama to report on how it assesses and mitigates the human rights risks arising out of its use of third-party staffing agencies in warehouses and distribution centers. And we have 3 speakers today who are going to walk us through the issue and the resolution. We're going to start today with Gaurav Sharma. Gaurav is a community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal. He was hired to work in the Dollarama warehouse through a temporary placement agency. He now organizes with his community for the rights of immigrant workers in the Montreal neighborhood of Park Extension. And he's also an actor with a passion for political theater, both in India and Montreal. So welcome, Gaurav. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thanks to you. You called me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Can you start by describing what it was like to work in the Dollarama warehouse?
Yes. First of all, my name is Gaurav, and I would like to thanks to you. You invites me, and you're doing a very good job, doing very well. So I would say that I have been at work Dollarama about the 1 year. So 2019 to 2020. So at that time, I worked as a pilot builder. My work is to make a pilots. Every day, I have to make a pilot from 8 to 10 and sometimes 12 pilots. It's my task. It's my job. So during that period, I gone with a lot of up and downs during my job. On 20th June 2020, I met with the accident. It was I feel that my back is too much pain. So due to uplift the heavy box. So I rushed to my supervisor. My supervisor said go to immediate hospital because they haven't any good equipment. They haven't any good first aid box for me. So I feel very embarrassed and went to hospital myself alone. And doctor gave me 2 week bed rest, and they said you don't pick heavy box. So after that, I quit my job because I feel that it is the in the Dollarama warehouse is not good for me because there is no good health and safety equipment over there. So there is no good training over there, and there are no any vigilance among the people, among the workers by the Dollarama's representative. So I spoke with my agency to convert my job into another for easier job. They're saying we cannot do that because you are hired by only for the pilot builder. So we cannot change your job, or we cannot give you easier job. So it is very difficult for me due to all these circumstances fallen on me. I quit my job and started other jobs.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Do you have a sense of how many workers at that warehouse were hired through these temporary placement agencies?
Actually, there is a 3, 4, I think 5 agencies who hired every day most of people's. I think 500, or I think maybe more. I didn't count it, but I think it's 500 or more than 500.
Okay. And did you, when you were on the warehouse floor, did you have quotas that you had to meet every day? Did you have to work very quickly?
Yes, because it's a pressure for us to make a 12 pilot, 10 to 12 pilots, and you know the pilot height is a 70 and a half. So it is very difficult for everyone to make a 10 to 12 pilots. So usually if I do more than hard work, mostly use 10. I make only 10 pilots. So every day they're saying yes, yesterday you did less pilots, today you have to work more and more. So this is the pressure. Due to that pressure, sometimes I feel tiredness, depressions, pressure on my mind, because it's a pandemic, and if I quit that job, we can't find another job. So this kind of, not I'm feeling, another people also feel same things. So we discuss sometimes this kind of things because it's a very hard for us for the. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Cora, for sharing your experience. I think it's really important to start these discussions yes. Hearing from somebody who's worked at these companies. So yes. We have a sense of what that's like. So thank you so very much. We're going to next invite Mustafa Henway, who you work with closely. Mustafa is a longtime community organizer, activist, radio producer, and writer. He's been a community organizer with the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal since 2007, organizing with textile warehouse workers and other precarious immigrants and migrants for both migrant and labor justice. Mustafa is currently organizing with warehouse workers working through temporary placement agencies. And at the same time, he's doing a PhD on logistics and warehouse workers at Concordia University. So Mustafa, could you just describe where you work and let us know whether what Gaurav is describing is consistent with other reports you've received from other workers?
Yes. Hi everyone, and thank you, Tamara. And so the Immigrant Workers Center is an organization that's a hybrid community labor organization that was founded in 2000 to work with mainly non-unionized immigrant workers who are filling the jobs that had very little protection, had very little recourse because they weren't unionized workplaces and sectors. So textile, cleaners, agriculture, and we both deal with questions of immigrant justice, but also workplace justice, because we feel in the current moment, those two issues are really combined for temporary foreign workers, for people who are asylum seekers, for people who are undocumented, that employers are able to manipulate people's status to be able to exploit them further. And the center now, we focus on trying to challenge and change the sort of the frameworks of how precarious work is made. So focusing a lot on temporary placement agencies, and also with the temporary foreign worker program to be able to, these are the two things that employers use to really undermine workers' basic rights and dignity. And so in terms of the case of Dollarama, this is absolutely consistent, with the experience of other workers, right? And so we've been doing outreach and campaigning there for the last decade. And why Dollarama became so important for us as a campaign is really because on a mass scale, the use of agencies in one workplace is, right? And so, and that Gaurav's experience is unfortunately well too common, right? Because the starting point is that Dollarama's warehouses and distribution center, where Gaurav works, the main distribution center, actually employ exclusively through temp placement agencies, and not just one temp placement agency, but several. And so this creates a whole dynamic where people are denied their basic rights, where health and safety is really ignored because a lot of it is outsourced, because under the law, the employer becomes the temp agency, not Dollarama. So a lot of the issues and sort of responsibilities, despite the fact that people are working inside Dollarama's distribution center or warehouse, those costs and those risks are outsourced to the agency. So you have this high rate of accidents. Agencies don't provide the health and safety equipment. They claim that everyone's just temp, so they don't have to follow the law. And so you really create this dynamic where there's a sense of impunity, but then you have this huge high rates of accidents. During the pandemic, people felt really scared during the pandemic. Workers were fired for speaking up. So, I mean, the Gaurav's experience is quite common.
Okay, thank you for that. Have you had any discussions with the company, with Dollarama? Have you approached them to ask them about workers' rights and for workers who are hired through these agencies?
Unfortunately, we've had no direct discussions with Dollarama. I mean, we've been campaigning, and unfortunately, if there has been a discussion, it's been in the public media. And unfortunately, there's kind of a discourse from the PR firm that Dollarama uses that everything is wonderful, the work conditions are wonderful, that they have competitive pay. But the issue is that Dollarama, if it was such a wonderful place, the question is, why is the turnover so high, right? And you have all of the same issues that you have at Amazon, right? People are walking nearly 8 minutes to get to their break. People are surveyed just to go to the bathroom, right? That they have to punch in and punch out to go to the bathroom. The workforce, when we talk about racialization, is exclusively immigrant, except management and a handful of workers out of hundreds, right? You have a health and safety training component that's 10 to 15 minutes. You have quotas. So just to give a sense of how bad and how fast paced it is at Dollarama, this is such a wonderful place to work, according to them, is that they move on average through their distribution center 2 million boxes a week. And there are distributors and there are pallet builders, like Gaurav said, and all of that work is done at a grueling pace. You literally have to be moving a box every 20 seconds to be able to meet your quota, right? And Dollarama actually hasn't expanded the facilities to proportion to the amount of stores they're adding. So what you have is this decrease of workspace, adding more and more workers and keeping such a faster pace. Dollarama doesn't have a second distribution center. There's only one for all of its outlets, right? 1,300 stores. So this creates a massive amount of workplace issues. And also people feel that they have no, that they're sort of just disposable, right? And this is, so it really creates a lot of issues within the workplace, right? In terms of accidents, high turnover, while they had to change the pay to be able to stop the turnover, right? And so, but the issue is that because people aren't hired permanently, so there's no need to feel to actually uphold people's basic labor standards, right? And that's the issue.
Thank you so much. I think you've really outlined how the use of these temporary worker agencies is creating a situation where workers with potentially precarious immigration status or who are not able to access the same supports and aren't able to access the protection from a union may be facing workforce conditions that are dangerous and obviously exploitative, and there's little opportunity with the present business model for workers to be able to address that issue. So thank you so much for laying that out for us. We're going to bring in Emma Pullman now. Emma is the Capital Stewardship Officer with the BC Government and Service Employees Union. And this is one of Canada's or one of BC's largest and fastest growing unions. And Emma has helped build this Capital Stewardship Program to leverage the union's fully divested 110 million general and strike funds to push for stronger investments that protect workers and the planet. Prior to BCGU, Emma has worked at Corporate Accountability Watchdog, as their lead campaign strategist, and as a journalist, a writer, and a researcher and a policy analyst for the BC and federal public services. And Emma is going to talk us through how investors can approach Dollarama and engage on these issues in the upcoming shareholder season.
Thanks, Tamara, so much. And thanks to the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network for putting this event on. I first just want to thank Gaurav and Mustafa so much for your words. I think in this line of work, something that we're often looking at is analyst reports, and we actually miss a lot of these really important kind of experiences directly from workers. And these perspectives are so critical. I think if I would have read an analyst report, and only an analyst report, we would have probably missed this issue. So BCGU has been in dialogue with Dollarama over the past few years, and we have continued to monitor ongoing worker and human rights issues at the company. So the proposal that we filed this year asks Dollarama to prepare a report outlining how it assesses and mitigates the human rights risks associated with the use of these third-party staffing agencies in its warehouse and distribution centers, just as we've just heard from Mustafa and Gaurav. Dollarama states that it is not responsible for hiring and training these workers, and actually on its financial statements, the costs of these staffing arrangements are sales costs as opposed to employee benefits. So, you know, we've been really concerned at this issue. And so, you know, the GRI standards define workers as all workers in a workplace controlled by an organization, and that in that case, an organization with this control, and in this case, we believe that Dollarama is in control in this situation, is positioned to take action to eliminate hazards, minimize risk, and protect workers from harm. There was a recent report from the Director of Public Health from Montreal that noted that the risk of occupational injury is between high and extreme for temporary agency workers. Agency workers get injured more often. They have their vulnerable status makes it harder to refuse unsafe work, harder to organize, harder to report injuries, and harder to get compensation when you invariably do get injured at work. So our research suggests that none of Dollarama's competitors, so that includes Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, Canadian Tire, and even Amazon, disclose using staffing agencies for their warehouse and distribution centers. And this might be because exactly what we've just heard, there is inherent risk in using them, including reputational risk. We kind of heard from Mustafa that Dollarama has an expansion plan that is underway. It's going to open hundreds of new stores, and they're actually opening one new store a week. And to facilitate that expansion, it needs these warehouse and distribution center workers, and these workers deserve justice. And so this vote is going to be going to a vote in June, and we really would appreciate your support in voting for this proposal.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think that really, this is one opportunity clearly for investors to weigh in and support a resolution that encompasses so much of what we've been hearing this year around the need for companies to address social risks in their supply chains. And we'll be circulating to everyone on this call a link to join the CCSN network, and there we'll be distributing materials relevant to the shareholder resolution in the future. And I think this really, again, touches on the themes and issues that COVID-19 has brought to light. One of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy, had there's a wonderful comment from Suzanne there, great work lifting this issue up to Mustafa and you. Arundhati Roy has a quote about the pandemic, which says the pandemic is, I'm paraphrasing here, but a paradox. It's an opportunity. It's a transition point between two different worlds and two different ways of doing things. And I think if you're looking at just the pragmatics of proxy voting, this particular resolution is an opportunity for investors to step in and articulate to the company their support for a way of doing business that incorporates the rights of workers irrespective of their migration status. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to move now to another issue that has really been at the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in Canada, and that, of course, is private nursing homes. The death rates and infection rates that we've seen in the nursing care sector in Canada have raised profound questions about the models behind and the delivery of care for our elders. And if we weren't aware of the links between poor working conditions and the quality of resident care before, we certainly are now. Canadian company Chartwell has really been at the heart of much of the controversy this year. And we have with us Anthony Shine from Share, my colleague at Share, to talk about the company. As Director of Shareholder Advocacy, Anthony leads Share's stewardship program and public policy advocacy. His career has been dedicated to social and political change. Prior to joining Share, Anthony held senior roles at an Ontario public sector trade union, where he worked with leadership on advocacy, governance, campaigns, and negotiation. Anthony has also worked extensively in municipal, provincial, and federal politics, both in government and on election campaigns. And Anthony wanted to highlight in his bio that he is an eternal optimist. And with that, I will turn it to you to explain why investors should consider withholding their votes for Director Mike Harris.
Thanks so much, Tamara, for that. And yes, I am an eternal optimist only because if I weren't, I'd probably be inclined to give up a lot of the time. So I try and keep that sunny outlook as best as I can. As Tamara said, my name is Anthony Shine, and I guess it says it right there on the screen. And I lead our engagement program on behalf of a network of institutional investors with now more than $70 billion in assets under management. And I'm joining you today from East York here in Toronto, which is the traditional lands of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people. And I want to just take a moment to honor and recognize the First Peoples of this territory and the ongoing contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to the vibrancy of this community. I certainly feel lucky and grateful to have the opportunity to live and work at the same time in this community and on this territory. Share's clients include universities, trade unions, pension funds, foundations, and Indigenous trusts, among others. And so we engage with companies on behalf of that network of institutional investors. Thanks so much to Emma and Mustafa for that great overview. It's really, I think, so important to hear about the pretty similar issues at Dollarama to those that I'm going to speak to a bit at Chartwell as well. It's a bit different in the sense that, I'm not talking quite so much about the sort of non-standard work, but still about what the role of human capital management is at Chartwell and the need for change. So I'm going to speak to both the vote recommendation around the chair of the board, but first I want to talk a bit more about the substance of our proposal itself. So in 2021, this year, the oldest of the baby boom generation, those people born in 1946, start turning 75, which some demographers say marks the first wave of the gray tsunami, which is just now starting to hit the shores of Canada and the sort of patchwork system of seniors care that we have. The long-term care sector, the private long-term care sector, has seen enormous growth over the past 20 years. And that's partly due to regulatory changes that allow for a lot more market access. We'll come back to that with the chair, Mike Harris, in a moment. But it's also due to the change in demographics and that aging population. For the first time, I think this year, seniors now outnumber school-age children in Canada. And while the sector is highly unionized, very highly unionized, standards of work are pretty widely considered to be poor, and it's grueling work. It's performed mostly by a workforce that is disproportionately women, women of color, and many first-generation immigrants to Canada as well. And advocates in the long-term care sector and for seniors have often linked inadequate working conditions with inadequate standards of care. They note that higher workloads mean less time to provide the support that residents need, and that a really high rate of turnover and a reliance on a part-time workforce correlate really closely with inadequate staff training and poor outcomes. And that's really the issue that's kind of at the center of our engagement with Chartwell, Chartwell's Seniors Retirement REIT. It's the connection between the management of the workforce and the quality of care. The Royal Society of Canada described human capital in seniors care last summer as a workforce crisis. In a report it published last June, the Society wrote, hands-on care is now almost entirely given by unregulated workers, care aides and personal support workers. They receive the lowest wages in the health sector and are given variable and minimal formal training. They're rarely part of the decision-making process around residents' needs. And studies have shown that they often have insufficient time to complete essential care and are at work of high risk of burnout and injury. So the really stark reality of the sort of so-called care in Canada's nursing homes during the pandemic has been really well documented, so I won't spend too much time on it. It's been documented by the Canadian Armed Forces, who were called in on numerous occasions to assist in homes during the first wave of the pandemic, by journalists who've written extensively on this, and probably most poignantly by the families of residents who have described the loneliness and fear and isolation of both residents and their families during the pandemic. I will say though, like just to remind us of the numbers here, of the 23,000 people who have died of COVID-19 in Canada during the pandemic, just about 70% of them have been linked to long-term care homes. In total, 55,000 long-term care residents contracted the virus over the past year. And that includes 51 homes operated by Chartwell that have been impacted by the virus, and at least 393 residents whose deaths have occurred in Chartwell homes. Chartwell is one of the largest for-profit care operators in Canada, as you know, and our engagement with Chartwell started as most of our work does. We wrote a letter, and my colleague Sarah, who you'll hear from about Walmart in a moment, and I met with the CEO and with senior management, and we probed the oversight, the data collection, the reporting that the company has around management of its workforce. And we found, unsurprisingly, that the current disclosure is inadequate, and it doesn't give investors or other stakeholders the information they need to assess performance. And clearly, the risks of inadequate standards are huge for investors, for residents, for families. And of course, the pandemic has brought enormous public scrutiny to the operation of care, of long-term care. So in that first set of meetings, we certainly pointed out some of those inadequacies, and we outlined the work that Cher and others have done to establish some baseline investor expectations around human capital management. First of all, establishing a clear function for accountability at the board level around human capital management. And secondly, a standard set of reporting around key workforce metrics. And those expectations are in line with a recently released set of investor expectations from UNI, the global union, around the long-term care sector internationally. It's certainly a worthwhile resource to take a look at that set of investor expectations. So in our first meetings, we provided examples of leading practices for disclosure. That does certainly need to include both qualitative and quantitative information that would allow shareholders to assess the effectiveness of the company's workforce policies and the robustness of its board oversight. It should also help shareholders properly understand the workforce risks and the challenges faced by Chartwell and how they're addressing them and how they're progressing against them. Again, the current disclosure was really inadequate, and while the company made some attempts to respond to the issues we raised, we heard many of the typical refrains we often hear from companies through our engagement. We'd love to report on those metrics, but we don't have the data yet. We're building a new database, so come back to us in a year or two. Those are pretty typical replies. But ultimately, we weren't able to get much traction with the company, so we filed a shareholder proposal on behalf of our client, which is the IBVM Foundation of Canada, asking the company to do simple things, same as I outlined above, establish board level oversight, and report on key workforce metrics. We met again with the company, and they still weren't able to make commitments, so that is going to come to a vote next month. We believe that Chartwell is facing particularly material reputational risks due to the concerns raised on the standards of care in for-profit long-term care and retirement homes. Public trust is really waning. An analysis of media coverage in the past 10 years shows that concerns about quality of care and safety are persisting and in fact are growing. Experts say that seniors' trust in long-term care is at an all-time low. In July of last year, 95% of Ontario seniors said that they would not feel safe basically in a long-term care setting. Only 2% said that they would prefer to be in a long-term care setting during the pandemic. And I'll just add, on a personal level related to that, my parents are in that exact age demographic. My dad will turn 77 next month. He already has kind of a hard time living independently, and we've had some of these conversations as a family about how best to support him. And I think we'll absolutely do everything we can to keep him living independently with other support rather than living in a retirement home or long-term care based on the experience of the last year. So that really just leads me to the fact that the disclosure of material workforce metrics and then coupling that with effective board oversight would contribute to a strong system of accountability and work for the workforce and help rebuild some of the confidence that's perhaps been lost in the sector. There is a clear risk to investors, to stakeholders, to residents and workers from the inadequate workforce management in long-term care and particularly at Chartwell. So for that reason, we're asking you to support our proposal, which will be voted at the meeting on May 20th. But in addition to that proposal, we're also putting forward a recommendation to withhold your vote or vote against the chair of the board, a fellow named Michael D. Harris, better known as Mike Harris to most of us. Mr. Harris has been a member of the board since 2003, and in fact, it was that position on the board was one of the first appointments he took after leaving office as Premier of Ontario, which he did the year prior. And in that role as Premier of Ontario, Mike Harris oversaw the deregulation of long-term care and really threw the door open to for-profit care. So there's a real through line from his time in office to the rapid expansion, massive expansion of for-profit care in Ontario, and he's been part of the profiting from that over the last 15 years since he left office. But that's actually not the main reason for our vote recommendation. The quality of care at Chartwell Homes during the pandemic has been unacceptable. It's been unacceptable to residents, to the public, and certainly should be unacceptable to investors as well. There is a clear need for accountability. As investors, the best way to achieve that accountability is through the board. The care is unacceptable, as I said, the level of disclosure is inadequate, and the lax board oversight is, in this case, unforgivable. Accountability is an essential component of corporate governance, and that's, I think, a pretty clear concept for most of us. But as former SEC Commissioner Luis Aguilar said in 2015, good corporate governance also reminds a company's board directors that they do not answer to management, but rather work for the true owners of the public corporation, the shareholders. And in this case, I would add that the investors and the board have a responsibility to the broader public and to residents of these homes as well. So that's the basis for our vote recommendation to withhold your votes from Michael D. Harris, Mike Harris, when the time comes. The proxy still hasn't been released, and so we're not 100% sure that he will be renominated for the board, but we expect he will be. The meeting will be out on May 20th, held on May 20th, and certainly we will circulate the proxy materials in our recommendation to go with it as soon as those are available. But again, the meeting is May 20th, and please mark your calendars and vote for Chair's proposal on human capital management and withhold or vote against Mike Harris as chair of the board. And I will pass it back to Tamara. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that very comprehensive summary. This is an issue, I mean, all of these issues affect our lives in all different ways, of course. And this is what in particular that the beneficiaries of many of the pension funds that we work with hold near and dear to their hearts, of course, because we all have elders in our lives. And I think that something to emphasize, there's two different asks here. There's a shareholder resolution, and there is, dependent on the proxy, a recommendation to vote against a director. A shareholder resolution is always, it's voluntary in terms of the board and the company bringing the recommendations of the resolutions, operationalizing them. It's a voluntary thing, whereas voting for or against and withholding your vote against a board member is more or less binding in most situations. So that means that the board would be very compelled to take the advice of its shareholders, should that be communicated through a vote. And so we would really encourage investors again to keep track of this issue and to consider this as the AGM approaches. So we're going to shift focus now to some of the large US companies that Canadian investors are likely to have in their equity portfolios. And we're going to start with McDonald's. And here we're going to be focusing on the investment risks of workplace sexual harassment and misconduct. And if you've been following the news on McDonald's, you'll have seen that sexual harassment has been an issue in the C-suite, and it's been an issue that permeates and works its way down throughout the workforce. And so we are very privileged to welcome from the US to start us off, Kimberly Lawson. Kimberly is a 28-year-old mother, former McDonald's employee, and leader in the fight for 15 and for a union. She began organizing with her coworkers in 2016 to win $15 an hour in union rights. After experiencing sexual harassment on the job at McDonald's, Kim became a key leader in demanding that McDonald's acknowledge its sexual harassment problem and put workers at the forefront in coming up with viable solutions. She's spoken in front of US lawmakers at rallies around the US and has been a feature in news outlets. Kim is fighting for a future where every worker can have a union with fair pay and benefits on the job. Kim, hi, welcome. Thank you so much. Where are you joining us from today?
Hello, Kansas City,
Kansas City.
Missouri.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit about the workplace culture at McDonald's?
It just goes to, okay. Okay, I want to say good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Kimberly Lawson, and I used to work at McDonald's. I'm here to tell you that McDonald's has a sexual harassment problem. Over the last 5 years, more than 50 McDonald's workers have filed sexual harassment complaints against the company. With support from the Fight for 15, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, and the American Civil Liberties Union. I am one of those workers. I am a single mother of a beautiful 6-year-old girl named Faith. Survival for me and my daughter is a daily challenge. I shouldn't have had to endure the heavy stress of sexual harassment too. No woman should. When I started at McDonald's 4 years ago, there was no mention of sexual harassment trainings, no mention of sexual harassment policies, and no mention of a phone number to call if we experience sexual harassment. McDonald's, a multi-billion-dollar company, does not seem to care. I have experienced harassment at McDonald's not just once, but twice. In the fall of 2017, a manager repeatedly made sexual comments toward me. He talked about my body, including telling me I had a nice body and a big butt, and telling me to leave my boyfriend. Because he was a manager, I felt trapped. I felt like I had no choice but to tolerate it. Though I rejected his advances as politely as I could, over and over again, they persisted. The only way I could avoid them was to try to rearrange my schedule so that I would not see him at all. So I actually lost hours off of my paycheck that I desperately needed for me and my daughter, just to be able to feel safe at work and just to stop being harassed. I want you all to take a moment to step in my shoes. During this time, I was homeless, going from place to place, staying with friends and coworkers, and I eventually ended up in a homeless shelter. So I'm riding the bus back and forth just to keep my job, but I'm having to worry about either losing hours at work or being unsafe at my own job. No woman should have to make a choice like that. I have also experienced harassment from a coworker. He used to stare at me. He would stand uncomfortably close to me. He would brush up against me and even touch my butt. He would give me gifts, which made me feel very uncomfortable. I reported his behavior to the general manager, but nothing was done. No woman should have to experience what I experienced. That is part of the reason why we are fighting for union rights. And that is why we organized the first strike against sexual harassment in more than 100 years. It's also why we've marched on McDonald's executives, calling on them to sit down with us to address sexual harassment once and for all. As we continue speaking out, more survivors are coming forward. This February, along with a handful of other survivors, I was featured on a CBS Sunday morning segment that focused on McDonald's system-wide sexual harassment problem and their failure to address the situation. Despite the growing number of workers coming forward and telling their stories of harassment, McDonald's is trying to ignore us. We know we are stronger together, and when we win our union, they won't be able to ignore us any longer. We will have the strength to protect one another and demand the justice we all deserve. I want my daughter to know that I have done everything in my power to make sure that she never has to go through the things I've gone through. McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the US, and it's more than just a leader in the fast food industry. Because of its size and influence, what McDonald's does has a ripple effect in our economy and our culture. Together, we must build the collective power to force McDonald's to change the culture of harassment and exploitation at their stores. We must force the company to actually respect the needs and the voices of workers like me. By sitting down at the tables and letting those of us affected by the problem help drive the solution. If they don't hear our experiences, if they don't respect our voices, then sexual harassment will continue. We're thankful to all of you shareholders for taking the time to listen to us and including us as you work toward getting McDonald's to acknowledge the sexual harassment problem at both their corporate and franchise stores. We think your work is a definite step in the right direction, and we hope to continue working together in holding this company accountable. We all know that actions speak louder than words. We need to make sure McDonald's actually follows through on these new standards in a way that is effective and consistent. There has to be consequences and accountability if they don't actually follow through on these new policies. Most importantly, I hope we can continue to work together to ensure a truly effective anti-harassment program that includes the voices of those directly affected by the problem, the workers like me. Us workers are the ones who make it possible for McDonald's to become a $100 billion company. The company needs to treat us with dignity and respect and take us seriously when we raise our voices about their pervasive problem of sexual harassment. We'll keep filing complaints, we'll keep organizing, we'll keep marching and going on strike, and we will keep fighting until McDonald's finally listens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. I really appreciate you sharing your story as a survivor. It takes such enormous courage to speak, especially to a group of people that you can't see. So thank you so much for that. I think what your story has really highlighted for me, well, two things. First of all, how difficult it is to stand up to sexual harassment when you're facing poverty, when you're in a vulnerable situation, when there's a real power dynamic between you and your managers, and when there's no clear way for you to seek recourse and protection. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think something that your story has really brought out is the reason why so many investors have come together to really drive home the point that sexual harassment is an investor issue. It's not an issue that's separate from investment. Workers are not simply a cost to companies. They're an asset. They produce the value in a company, and it's incumbent upon investors to ensure that this risk of sexual harassment is mitigated through company management practices, and also that it is a governance issue. So like you said, that it works its way up throughout the company. And on that note, we're going to invite our next speaker, who is Priya Mathur. Priya is president of Trustees United for Justice and Equality, and they have really been at the forefront of spreading the word that sexual harassment is an investor issue and that trustees can step in and take effective action. Priya previously served for 16 years on the board of the California Public Employees Retirement System. For those of you who are on this webinar and new to this, this is one of the largest pension funds in the world. And she was the first female board president. Priya is also a board director of Astia, I hope I'm saying that right, a nonprofit venture capital fund, which connects women-led startups with investment capital. So Priya, you've heard from Kim about workforce culture at McDonald's, how it impacts people's lives. You were in a position for many years where as a trustee, you had a fiduciary responsibility to incorporate ESG considerations such as these into investment analysis and decision-making processes. So can you walk us through how investors can respond to these issues at McDonald's specifically?
Thanks so much, Tamara. I'm delighted to be with all of you today, and really just so grateful for the comments of Kimberly Lawson and for the efforts of her and her colleagues at McDonald's, who've so bravely come forward to share their really traumatic stories of sexual harassment and violence at McDonald's restaurants. I also am grateful for the comments of the previous speakers, and Anthony Schlein in his comments about Chartwell. You know, I have a very personal experience with that, where I lost my grandmother this past year due to COVID at a care facility, a long-term care facility, and it's such an important issue for so many families today. I'm going to share a few slides, so bear with me for just a quick moment as I do that. Oops, sorry, let me start again from the beginning. Sorry, one quick second. I thought I had it all queued up. Okay. Now we should be there. So Trustees United for Justice and Equality was started 2 years ago by a group of California-based pension fund trustees. And we founded Trustees United because we realized that this area of human capital management was not being adequately addressed by, and particularly about sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace, was not being adequately addressed by investors. And in fact, we thought investors were ignoring key costs related to sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace as they pertain to their investment portfolios. Specifically, obviously, the obvious ones are litigation risk and litigation and settlement costs, but also areas of attrition and recruitment, retention, and various other costs that are less obvious to investors. McDonald's is a key case where sexual harassment really is a problem. And of course, Kimberly's story illustrates that. But let me just share a study, results from a study that McDonald's itself initiated a couple of years ago. And in that study of 782 female restaurant workers, 75% report being sexually harassed at work, with 71% reporting that they were reprimanded for reporting such sexual harassment. And notably, so many of the workers that are subjected to sexual harassment at McDonald's are under 18 years old. And that's because, you know, working at a McDonald's or McDonald's restaurants is a job that many teenagers seek out while they're still in high school. Now, this was McDonald's own study, but they've rejected the results of their studies, claiming that the sample size was not large enough. Of course, they have not initiated a new survey. We've seen many reports in the press about McDonald's sexual harassment problem from The Nation, from various other, from CBS. There was a very good CBS morning news spot on this issue, which highlighted many of the workers. And of course, we know that the cost of sexual harassment impacts the workers significantly. As Kimberly pointed out, it's resulted in lost wages and a need to rearrange her schedule. And that is true for many, many workers in McDonald's, but it also has an impact, a loss, a cost for investors. Just a few points about McDonald's. It has about 2 million employees, mostly at franchise establishments. It generates about $111 billion in sales. It has more than 38,000 restaurants globally, 93% of which are franchises. And from their own annual report, they say that the company requires its franchisees to meet rigorous standards, and that the business relationship with franchisees is designed to facilitate consistency and high quality at all McDonald's restaurants. But if that's the case, and it continually builds on its competitive advantages of system alignment, how can McDonald's control franchise menu, service, restaurant design, and promotions, but still claim that it is unable to establish effective harassment policies and practices, monitoring and enforcement mechanisms? Now, they've noted in their 2019 annual report that potential exposure to reputational and other harm regarding workplace practices or conditions of those of their independent franchisees or suppliers, including those giving rise to claims of sexual harassment or discrimination, may materially impact their results. So they acknowledge that this is the case and yet still have failed to adequately address these issues. Now, the board, so over the past 4 years, as Kimberly noted, McDonald's employees have filed more than 50 sexual harassment complaints. This is both to the EEOC as well as filing lawsuits, including a $500 million class action lawsuit filed in Florida against McDonald's last year. Now, you may also have heard about the former CEO, Steve Easterbrook's misconduct while CEO of McDonald's. He was accused of having an inappropriate consensual relationship that was inconsistent with the code of conduct at McDonald's. But subsequent to the board's bungled investigation, it has come to light that he's had several other engagements or involvements with women at McDonald's throughout his tenure. And the board has been forced to revisit its dismissal, which it did. It dismissed Easterbrook without cause. So it's been forced to revisit that and has now filed a lawsuit against Easterbrook, trying to reclaim some of the $57 million severance package that they gave him as part of his departure from McDonald's. Now, last year, Change to Win did sponsor a vote no or a withhold vote campaign against the compensation committee chair, which received 15% of support of shareholders. So all of this together really calls for an overhaul of the board. The board chair, Hernandez, has served on McDonald's board for 25 years and has overseen this extensive culture of sexual harassment at McDonald's. The compensation committee chair, Richard Lenny, oversaw the ineffective Easterbrook investigation, which resulted in inadequate results and ultimately a $57 million severance package that should not have been awarded to the ex-CEO. Pervasive sexual harassment has continued at McDonald's restaurants unchecked. McDonald's reputation has been damaged by extensive coverage in the media, and McDonald's faces costly sexual harassment litigation. So with that, that concludes my my slides. But I just wanted to finish by saying just how important this issue is. It's not simply a McDonald's issue. It certainly is an issue at many other similar establishments across the U.S., across the world. But this is the first step to really addressing this issue with a large company that has significant franchises, and they cannot be allowed to be shielded by the franchise structure from their obligation to maintain appropriate workplace practices, policies, and enforcement, particularly in the area of sexual harassment. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Priya, and Kim as well. Thank you again. One of the interesting things I think about McDonald's is that it's showing that the type of work that investors are doing and engaging the company on sexual harassment is starting to very slowly chip away at this massive edifice of an issue. It's not, the fight isn't done, but McDonald's is turning around and it's paying attention. And that's as a result of the work of workers like Kim and the work of people such as Priya as well. Cher has also been engaging McDonald's, and we had a resolution filed there that we withdrew because the company agreed to provide global brand standards to both its corporate and its franchise restaurants, as well as a requirement for anti-harassment and anti-discrimination training for all its stores across the globe. And it's committed to an ongoing dialogue as well with a process and timelines for implementation. And I think we all know that the next step one is getting these kinds of commitments. Step two is actually seeing them come to life and be implemented in a way that's meaningful for workers. So the story certainly isn't over, but I think this gives us reason to keep pushing. So thank you both for your presentations. We do have one more speaker. Last but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Sarah Cuchuhie Tano, who is Senior Shareholder Engagement and Policy Analyst at Share. Sarah has a background in non-financial auditing, and she engages companies on issues such as decent work, human rights, and supply chain due diligence. Before joining SHARE in 2019, Sarah researched transparency in the extractive and climate change disclosure at Université Laval, and Sarah holds a master's degree in environmental law from Université Laval. And Sarah's going to be talking about 2 resolutions. We made it difficult for her at Amazon and at Walmart. And these are 2 companies that have also received their fair share of attention for their workforce practices over the course of the pandemic. And she's going to, please do stick around. I know it's been an hour, but she's going to highlight the intersections between racial justice and workforce practices at both companies. So with that, I will hand it to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Tamara. So hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Cuchuhie Tano, and I am a senior analyst at SHARE. So today I will discuss how racial justice is taking more space during this proxy season, and to illustrate this voting issue, I will focus on 2 important proposals addressing racial equity issues at Walmart and Amazon. So the deaths of George Floyd, Amo Amory, and Breonna Taylor in 2020 spurred widespread protests against police brutality and racial justice across the US and in the world. The shocking deaths of the 3 African-American were tough reminders for many people that we still have a long way to go to achieve racial equality. Many studies indicate that racial inequalities are still prevalent in the US and in Canada. And while the legalized racial discrimination has been abolished, data on social and economic welfare show that disparities persist in education, housing, employment, wealth, and representation in leadership positions. And as you all know, it is difficult to address centuries of discrimination, but it doesn't mean there is nothing to do about it, because the problem is too big. To the contrary, shareholder engagement and proxy voting are very powerful tools to contribute to dismantling systemic racism, especially now because the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated racial inequalities. According to the CDC, Black or African-American people are 3 times more likely to be hospitalized after being infected and are twice more likely to die. And this is even worse for Indigenous population, whose hospitalization rate is 4 times higher, and this rate is more than twice higher. Data also show that visible minorities are facing much more difficulties in the job market during and outside the pandemic. And we can make the same observations here in Canada. So what does it mean for investors? There are a lot of research that demonstrate positive correlations between a more diverse workforce and firm performance. But as investor, I think that we really need to go beyond the outdated conversation around costs and benefits to have a more inclusive workplace and equal treatment and opportunities to all. In 2021, it should not be optional for companies to choose whether it is okay that the group of employees, because of their ethnicity or race, don't benefit from the same working conditions as their white colleagues. There is increasing pressure on companies from employees, unions, and the civil society in general to address racial discrimination and provide workers with decent work conditions. And the Biden administration is also pushing a more social agenda than its predecessor, Donald Trump, that would provide more protection to workers. Investors are also increasingly concerned by decent work issues, including how companies intend to close existing gaps and contribute to a fair recovery. Just to give you an idea, this year, 69 shareholder proposals were filed in the US on workforce diversity and equal advancement. And to that, you can add 30 resolutions that specifically address board diversity. This is twice the number of proposals filed last year on this topic, and it clearly illustrates the interest that investors have for advancing racial equality in the corporate world. Now, what it means for companies is that they are expected from investors and the public to demonstrate leadership on that issue. This means identifying whether and what are the existing racial issues within their organizations and how they can address these problems in the most effective way. To illustrate investors' expectations on that topic, I would like to focus on 2 proposals that will be submitted to a vote in the coming weeks. For the first proposals, I would like to talk about the 1-5 at Walmart by a coalition of investors, including SHARE on behalf of the IBBM Foundation. This proposal asks the board to report to shareholders on whether and how the company's racial justice goals and commitments align with the starting pay for all classifications of Walmart associates. This is a very interesting proposal because it is at the intersection of racial justice and minimum wage. And the goal of this proposal is to get Walmart to identify the racial pay gaps and leverage the starting pay to end racial inequalities within its organization. Next slide, please. Wage increase is the most direct route to racially equitable pay practices. This also makes a significant difference to the economy in general. A study from McKinsey estimated that in 2019, the racial wealth gap grew by over 50% from the 90s to 2016, and that it will cost the US economy up to $1.4 trillion between 2019 and 2028. And research in general indicate that economic, racial, and gender inequalities have slowed the US economic growth. Now, just a bit of context. Walmart is one of the largest employers in the US with 1.6 million of workers in the US only and 2.3 million workers around the world. Over 46% of Walmart's associates are people of color and about 21% are Black and African American. In June 2020, Walmart CEO Doug McMillon sent a memo to its employees about advancing racial equity. In the memo, it explained Walmart's commitment to help replace the structures of systemic racism and build frameworks of racial equity and justice. He actually recognized that Walmart had an enormous opportunity to use the scale of its business to make a difference. And he said that the company will evolve its recruiting and hiring practices and is committed to fair pay. Next slide, please. A month ago, the company revealed some aspects of this commitment, including that it will raise its wages for 400,000 employees so that the average starting pay reaches around $15.25. We have had positive discussions with the company overall, and I can say that it is working towards improving employees' working conditions, including wages and shift scheduling. However, this also means that a significant portion of Walmart's employees make less than $15 per hour. And as you all can imagine, this is certainly not enough to live decently in the most expensive areas in the US, but it is also not sufficient in low-cost locations. And you can add to that the fact that Black and Latino retail workers are more likely to be involuntarily working part-time. Any starting pay below $15 is too low to afford daycare, to pay rent, or even to go to the doctor. Now, from Walmart's perspective, this also represents an issue for two reasons. One, a precarious workforce is not good for business in the long term, as it may reduce job satisfaction and induce low productivity and poor performance. This is particularly important in a customer-facing industry like retail. And secondly, by resisting a $15 starting pay, Walmart lags behind some of its peers. 3 years ago, its main competitor, Amazon, established a $15 minimum wage, and Target, Best Buy, and Costco followed through. Now we know that Walmart will increasingly find itself at a disadvantage with its competitors to attract and retain employees. Just to conclude on Walmart, we believe that the company has not demonstrated how its commitments and actions are aligned with its commitments to address racial justice. And actually, we don't have sufficient information to understand the racial pay gap. So the first step would be for Walmart to provide an analysis of the demographics of starting wages and what that data shows vis-a-vis the company's stated commitments to address racial inequity. So the proposal will be voted at the AGM on the 2nd day of June. Feel free to reach me anytime by email if you have any question about this proposal. Now, speaking of Amazon, there is another resolution that investors need to pay attention this proxy season. Next slide, please. The New York State Common Retirement Fund and other shareholders, including share on behalf of the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, co-filed a shareholder resolution asking the company to conduct a racial equity audit to assess its impact on civil rights, racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's been years that Amazon is facing widespread criticism for discrimination, whether this is related to workplace issues or the use of its products and services and the effect they may have on Black and Latino communities. Just to name a few, a Black employee at an Amazon warehouse was called by Amazon General Counsel as not smart or articulate after he led a walkout over safety concerns and got fired. And as a result, this employee filed a lawsuit alleging that there is a discrimination problem against Black and Latino workers at Amazon. Another issue, Amazon's workers are disproportionately Black and Latino, especially in the warehouse, where they are exposed to unsafe and poor working conditions, including high exposure to the COVID-19 virus, with little to no opportunity to voice their concerns and organize. Amazon has also been criticized by employees, lawmakers, and regulators for biased promotion practices, discriminatory employee surveillance, and other issues. I don't have enough time to list all the issues found at Amazon, but this gives you an idea of how problematic the company's employment practices are and also its product. And what I mean is that the issue of systemic racism goes beyond the workplace at Amazon. The product and services it offers to the public and companies also pose a number of discrimination issues. For instance, AWS facial surveillance technology disproportionately surveils people of color, immigrant, and civil society organizations, which violate civil rights. Next slide, please. So racial equity audits are, next slide, please. Yeah. Racial equity audits are powerful tools to identify racial biases and pervasive and sometimes hidden discrimination issues. Racial equity audits present many benefits. It can help companies to identify whether a company's policies, practices, and products are equitable and non-discriminatory for employees, for its customers, and the communities in which it operates. For a company like Amazon, it would also help to identify the blind spots and would be able to address its problem of systemic racism in an effective way. Secondly, when you identify the problem, you can address the problem. So these audits provide companies with the right foundation to implement changes to existing programs or new measures or initiatives where it has identified racial equity and equity issues. And lastly, racial equity audits help companies to assess whether they have sufficient mechanisms in place to monitor the effectiveness of its anti-discrimination policies and practices. Now, it is important to understand that conducting a racial audit is not an end in itself. It's certainly not a solution. This is a first step that formalizes a company's commitment to address racial inequality within its organization. To be effective, these audits should be done in consultation with stakeholders, including employees and their representative bodies. Besides, it is recommended that these audits are performed by an independent third party, which could identify racial biases and issues with a fresh eye. Finally, the results of these audits should be public because there is nothing worse than a company trying to hide that it has racial issues. Investors and the public welcome companies that proactively recognize that they are having issues and commit to establish more racially equitable practices. A transparent audit will also help stakeholders and shareholders to assess the effectiveness of the policies and practices implemented by Amazon and contribute to restore employees and public trust in the company. Several companies have already committed to do such audits, including Facebook, Starbucks, and Airbnb. The proposal will be submitted to a vote at the company's AGM on May 26. So just to conclude, I want to say that addressing systemic racism should be a priority for investors. The two proposals I highlighted were filed at US-based companies. However, they are still very relevant to Canadian investors for several reasons. The first one is that As shareholders in these companies, Canadian investors have an equal responsibility to support the dismantling of systemic racism. Your ability to vote on these US resolutions can make a difference. Secondly, because of the scale of Walmart and Amazon's businesses, addressing racial justice would have impacts beyond the US borders and would also drive more equitable practices in Canadian businesses. In Canada, the vast majority of companies don't disclose any metrics that would allow investors to assess their efforts to advance racial equity issues. So I encourage you to vote in favor of these two shareholder proposals this season, and do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. I'll be happy to help or direct you towards the right person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a lot of content that you managed to squeeze in there. Really appreciate it. I do want to say just before we take questions that Amazon has also been in the news lately due to a recent union vote at a warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, and the company prevailed over that vote. The Committee on Workers' Capital, which is an international network of labor unions and trustees, issued a statement this morning for investors that describes the anti-union campaign and details how it violated ILO conventions. And it also includes some questions that investors can ask Amazon. So we'll be circulating that in our follow-up note as well. So we do have, we have two questions. I'm gonna go just to the first one. My organization's assets are invested in a pooled fund and we don't vote proxies, but that is managed by my asset manager. How can I bring these vote recommendations forward? Does anyone on the panel want to speak to this? I'll check there first.
Tamara, I'm happy to address that question. This is an issue we hear from a lot of investors, asset owners, is that they've pooled their capitals and they've given away their proxy voting rights. Now, there's a couple of things that you can do. One is that you can explicitly, in your contract with your you can ask to retain your voting rights. So that is not something you have to give away in an agreement with an investment manager. Secondly, you can also ask your investment manager how they are going to be voting and engage them on the issues that matter to you and ask them to sign up to your principles around these types of issues.
No problems there. Great. Yes, thank you, Priya. That's exactly it, that trustees can step in and negotiate to retain voting rights. Absolutely agree. Share as well offers a tool called Proxy Voting Audit that allows investors to look and see how their proxies were voted. And this can be something really informative in bringing the board up to speed in terms of the consistency between proxy voting and a board's investment policy. A small correction here, the IBVN Foundation co-filed the proposal at Walmart, and then Catherine Donnelly Foundation co-filed the one at Amazon. Both were facilitated by Share. Dieter, as well, from Change to Win, has posted some information about racial equity proposals. I think this would be in response to Jane Ritchie's question there about tracking. Before we end, does anyone else have any questions? I don't see any more. Nothing yet. Okay, well, I do want to thank you all for taking time to listen to our panelists. And of course, I really want to thank our panelists for taking the time to join us today. As I've said a few times, we'll send some updates about these resolutions in the coming weeks and months. If you are not on our mailing list, please do join. We'll send a link out in a follow-up. For Canadian unions and worker-nominated trustees who attended this webinar, the CCSN will be organizing a virtual trustee convening on social issues and alternative asset classes next. And signing up for our list is really the best way to stay informed. And of course, I would invite you all to get in touch if you have any further questions. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days and afternoons wherever you may be.